Welcome back for another episode of the Quantum Podcast. Today I sit down with Patrick Chester. Patrick is a former gambling addict and has turned his life around to now help those who are going through the problems which he went through during his past. Patrick's addiction went on for over 15 years, stealing from those around him and stealing money through his business. He eventually ended up in prison as a result of it all catching up with him. It's a very interesting story with some great insights involved with it. So I hope you enjoy this one. And Patrick, thanks for your time. I really appreciate you opening up the way you did. So remember to follow Patrick wherever you can, and also like, subscribe, and share the podcast with anyone who may be interested. Thank you. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about where you started, how this journey started for you.
Yeah, good question. So, really, I was through high school and college, actually mainly college, so when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, I started playing cards and gambling with friends as just a casual thing, just a hobby. I didn't see any problem with it. I didn't recognize the dangers associated with it. And so, that's kind of where it began for me, which is consistent with most gamblers. It starts in the early, teens and early 20s. And so, but what began to happen was, when I got out of college and into my 20s and early 30s, I started gambling on football games, American football. I was primarily a sports bettor. I wasn't necessarily a casino gambler. And so what began to happen was I started placing wagers on college football games and then NFL football games. And that kind of started, like I say, right around my mid 20s and into my early 30s. And what kind of the starting point for me, I look back on it now, was right around 2001. I'll never forget it. I won $900 betting on a few college football games one day. And that was, at the time, I didn't have a lot of money. I wasn't married, didn't have any kids. And winning $900 was a rush, right? So, that kind of stuck with me and triggered something in my brain back then where I'm like, wow, I can actually make money doing this. And so that's, looking back on it now, right around that period of time, 2001, when I would have been around 28 years old, is kind of where it really began.
Yeah, because I remember that. So in the UK, it's 18, you can start gambling. Because obviously in the US, it's different, isn't it? There's a lot of states that actually you can't sports bet and stuff. But
that's good, interesting, because when I started betting on sports, we didn't have state-sponsored sports betting. We had one state in the country, and that was Nevada, where Las Vegas is, right? Las Vegas, you can bet legally on sports in Nevada back then when I started gambling. But you couldn't in any other state in the country legally. So I was betting primarily through bookies. I had people in Nevada where I would send them money and they would place bets for me.
Oh, interesting.
And also too, I was betting through offshore accounts.
Yeah.
Sending money to places like Costa Rica and Puerto Rico and things like that, and gambling that way. But now, I think it's up to 32 states in the U.S. where we actually have legalized sports betting. So it's much different, much more accessible now.
Yeah. So in the UK, obviously, it's from 18 years of age that you can get into it. And I remember, so the day of my birthday, I signed up for a couple gambling sites, and I won. So I placed a pound bet, and I think I won. It was over £200 on that first one. And I remember that feeling of like, oh my God, I've just off like a pound, I've made 200. How's that happen? Like, and then for a few weeks, I was just placing bets on like football leagues that were in like Estonia. And then a few weeks later, I was like, why am I doing it? So I stopped for a while because of that thing, because it entices you to want to bet on these stupid things that you would never understand or never know.
That's interesting. Yeah. For me and many, many people that struggle with gambling and have big time gambling addictions, there's no, as I describe it, right, there's no shut off valve for us, right? Many people can gamble. It's like alcohol or drugs. I can drink, but I know when to stop. A lot of people can gamble and they know when to stop, but with any addiction, there are some of us when it comes to gambling that there's no shut off valve there. We want to keep going and keep chasing our bets, right? Keep chasing one bad bet after another. And I did the same thing. I started betting on cricket matches that I couldn't even watch, right? Because they're going on in the middle of the night, and
Mm.
European soccer, um, well, football over there, I guess, but you know what I mean. And so I'm betting on these things that are completely out of my scope, and I have no knowledge or nothing. But I'm consumed by it, and that's kind of what happens.
Yeah, it's the consumption, but you don't realize it. So, like, at what point was it for you that you realized that this was becoming an all-consuming habit?
Right. And so that point came in, I would say right around kind of 2003, 2004, right in that time frame. I wasn't married yet, didn't have a family yet. I was living with roommates, and I started, instead of paying my bills, instead of paying my share of the rent every month, I was using that money to gamble with. And then when rent, when the end of the month came or the first of the month, it was time for me to pay my share of the rent. I would have to go to my roommates and say, "Sorry guys, I don't have the money," and I'd make up some you know ridiculous excuse as to why I didn't have the money. But the truth of the matter was, I was gambling with it. And in my mind, it was then that I realized, what, there's an issue here, and it's time to do something about it. But I didn't do anything about it because I convinced myself that I could get myself out of the financial hole that I was creating by gambling more. But it was around that period of time, 2003 to 2004, right in there, where in the back of my mind, I started to realize that there's an issue here.
Yeah, because it's that thing of, because you won $900 once in your head, that because of that dopamine hit from that point in time, in your head, you still believe that it's possible to win the $900 again. But obviously, it's completely different because it's different games, different like time. Like, so what I tend to find with people is when they do something for the first time. So say maybe they don't pay the rent for the first time, it then snowballs and snowballs because they think, oh, I can actually just get away with it. And you tell a lie here, it becomes a lie there, a lie elsewhere. So did it just become easier for you to not pay rent and just lie to roommates and just be like, I don't have the money because of X, Y, or Z?
That is really well laid out and well said right there, because that's exactly what happens, right? You go down that road once, and as a gambler, you tell a lie once, it becomes easier to do it a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and then it becomes just a matter of um, it just becomes commonplace. That's what we do because we've done it before. We'll do it again, and I'll give you an example. Right around that same period of time we were just talking about, 2002, 2003, I was actually working for a friend of mine. He owned his own company. I was working for him, and he was out of town and left his checks. He left his checks for us to write checks if we needed to buy material or equipment or whatever for the business. And I started writing checks to myself because I needed money to gamble with. And I did it once, and then I did it twice. And I remember the first time I did it, I thought, man, this is really, you're going down a slippery slope right now. But I did it once and I got away with it. The second time was easier. The third time was even easier than that. And so it becomes this pattern and this cycle that we get into where we can rationalize just about everything we do. We can lie to just about anybody we come across because we've done it once, we can do it again. And there was nobody they couldn't figure out what was going on with me. My friends and family, they didn't know they just knew there were issues, but they couldn't pinpoint it. And so nobody could really call me out or hold me accountable for it because they really didn't know what was going on. But yeah, it's kind of a cycle that we get into that is really frightening.
Yeah. So obviously you managed to hide it for quite a while from your family, but so when you met your wife, or say you were with your wife at that point, and then you moved in together, how are you still hiding that from her? Because obviously, when you move in with someone in a relationship, you need to know each other. You need to know where each other are, whether they're stable or they're not. So, how did you manage to deal with that side of it?
Right. So my wife and I got married in 2006, and we didn't move in. We moved in prior to that, I think in 2005. And, really our finances were separate at the time. And then we got married, and right, exactly. When you're married, you're no longer, I mean, your finances are one, you're a team, right? Well, my wife she trusted me to pay the bills. She trusted me to pay the mortgage payments and the rest of the bills, and just trusted me to do it. And at the time, we still had separate bank accounts. So it was hard for her to really see what was going on. She just took me at my word. And many gamblers will tell you, many compulsive gamblers will tell you that we become very good at hiding the truth from people and spinning the truth and confusing people. In fact, sometimes I think the way I look at it, the spouse or the family member that's closest to you, sometimes it's harder for them to pick up on it because they want to believe you, whatever you're telling them. And we become professional liars, which is, um, it's a hard thing to say, but it's the truth. As gambling addicts, we become professional liars, and we can convince just about anybody of anything. And so that's what went on for the early part of my marriage. As we can get into later on, it was discovered. But you know, um, my wife knew there were problems. She just couldn't pinpoint exactly what
Yeah.
was the root of it.
So, did anyone come close to finding out that it was a problem in that time?
I don't. A lot of people, again, friends and family members knew there were issues because there were financial inconsistencies and all kinds of weird things were happening, but nobody really knew it was gambling. I think they probably just thought I was really bad at managing my money. But I would tell people stories and it wouldn't make sense. And then this friend would talk to this friend, and I had told them two completely opposite stories, and they're like, this doesn't add up. So people would say things to me and family members would make comments, but they couldn't really. It wasn't until later on, again, which we can get into around 2014, 2015, where um, friends and family members actually discovered what was going on.
So it was around 11 years then that this went on without anyone really, without it coming out to everyone.
Yeah, yeah, which is shocking, but it's not that uncommon again with gambling addicts. But mine went on for. I was able to keep mine hidden for longer than most, but it's a similar pattern, and it's you don't see, the way I look at it is you can look at a drug addict and you can look at an alcoholic and you can see the physical effects on them, right? You can see it
Yeah.
on them. With a gambling addict, you don't see that. It's more the mental side of it with the gambling addict, where mentally we're a mess, but physically it's really you don't see that. Okay, and so
Yeah.
it's I refer to it as kind of the silent addiction because it's there and it's bubbling underneath the surface, but you just can't recognize what's going on.
Yeah. It's quite intense because you are obviously feeling the effects of it. Like physically, and mentally, you're probably feeling the effects of it. When you say you lose $100 here, 200 there, and then you're like, oh fuck, I can't pay the rent again. How much? What was like the most you were spending at the time on a single bet?
So if I take you through, as we get into around 2009, which was the year our first son was born, 2009, 2010, I began working for myself as a contractor, as a general
Hmm.
contractor. And so I had access to large amounts of money. Clients would, for example, I would sit down with a client, we would sign a contract for a project, and they would hand over a deposit check for 20, 30, $40,000 because they trusted me. Well, what I would do with that money is, because I had become so consumed with gambling, I would take half of it or more and gamble with it. So around 2009, 2010, I started making bets that were 10, 15, $20,000 bets,
Wow.
on a single game, right? And so what started out as, $100 bets back in the early 2000s, by 2010 is now up to, 15, 20, $25,000 a bet.
Yeah. See, even to this day, I've never bet more than £10 on a single bet, because I know for a fact if I was to bet 15, I think 15's okay. If it's to bet 20, I think 20's okay. Like because with me losing £10, I'm like, fuck, like £10 gone. That's like, and I can't even imagine 15,000 $10,000, 15,000 where that's meant for, a job. Like it's literally a job on the line based on whether this bet comes in or not. So the first time you lost one of those bets where you'd used the client's money, how did it make you feel?
I was terrified. It what had started out as fun and then progressed to something that was stressful. And like we talked about earlier, I recognized there was an issue. I didn't address it. We're now at a point where, when I took that first deposit check and started betting, I think it was a $12 or $13,000 bet, and lost it. I entered into this world of darkness, okay, and fear and paranoia, because now I'm terrified. I've got to this client trusted me to do their job, and now I've lost their money, and I can't even get materials on the job site to do that because I don't have the money. And so then I go to another client, right, and accept a deposit from them. And my thinking, in my delusional brain, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to take $15,000 from this client, bet that on a game, and I'm going to win, right? The mentality of a gambling addict is never we're going to lose. It's always that we're going to win. And so I'm thinking, well, if I just win that, I can win the money back that I used from the other client, get that job going. So you can kind of see the path, right? And so
Yeah.
I would occasionally win a bet, but the pattern was to lose more than I won. And so over time, I was living in a world of darkness and fear, basically.
So it is so scary to think, like, you've lost one client's money and it's not a little amount of money, and then maybe you use the seconds to try and win that back and you lose that as well. It becomes this deeper and deeper hole that you just like, how do you even get out of it? But so when did it go from, that where you lost the first client's money to then when clients were finding out?
Great question. It was, I think right around 2011, 2012. At this point, I have 10 to 15 clients that I owe money to, anywhere from 3,000 to 40,000. Okay.
Wow.
And so what began to happen then was, and I would, my MO, with all of them was to delay and come up with excuses. Hey, I'll get back on the job in a month. I've just got a health issue, or there's a material issue. I can't get this. And, well, you tell that story to enough people, and sooner or later they start to figure it out. And in the internet age, they started to connect with each other, because what would happen is they would file online complaints about me, and then somebody would see that and they would say, whoa, that same thing happened to me. And somehow those people would connect. Eventually, there were enough of them that they started to go to the state and file complaints with the state. And then the prosecutors would get involved, and law enforcement would get involved. And, that was around 2012 when that started to happen.
That's so intense. So at what point did the lawsuit come to fruition then? How long after was that?
Yeah. So it wasn't, well, there were lawsuits, which were on the civil side, right? But what happened in 2013 was I was charged with 2 counts of first-degree theft. Okay, 2 of my clients had taken this far enough with the state, had enough evidence to present to the state. The state then turns it over to law enforcement. Actually, no, the law enforcement turns it over to the prosecutors, and they have enough evidence, and then they charge me. In 2013, they charged me, again, with 2 counts of theft. And so it's at that point where I am no longer allowed to work as a contractor in the state of Washington where I live. My license had been revoked. My reputation was in the gutter. There was no way I could work anymore. And so I'm now at a point where it just becomes this game of hustle to me. I no longer have the resources and avenues to get money from clients. I'm hustling from friends or family members and trying to get money that way.
Yeah. So did your wife find out at that point, or was it later?
It was a little bit later. We're kind of getting there. This was around 2013, and then in 2014, I'll tell you the low point for me, rock bottom, as some of us call it, was in 2014, where I was desperate. I was out of money, out of resources, had lost many friends through my behaviors and my choices, and hadn't owned up to any of this to anybody. I hadn't told anybody about it. I was keeping it a secret. And I took $9.50 from my 5-year-old son's piggy bank in November of 2014. And I remember sitting in the car later that afternoon, staring out the window and contemplating suicide, thinking, there's no way I can go on anymore. My wife and my son will be better off without me. I can't continue this, and it was so, the lowest point in my life was that day. And it was $9.50. It wasn't the 20,000 or 30,000 or 40,000 that I took from a client and lost. It was the $9.50 that I took from my 5-year-old son, and so that was, like I said, that was November of 2014. And then as we can get into here shortly thereafter is when my wife would find out a few months later.
How did you manage to go nearly 2 years from being convicted of, theft to your wife finding out in 2015?
Yeah, so the way that works is I was actually charged in 2013 with those crimes. I was charged with them, but over here the legal process takes a while to play out. Okay, so once you're charged with something, it could be 1 to 2 years before you're actually finally convicted.
Okay.
It's just the process. It just takes a long time. And so what happened was actually in December of 2014, my attorney presented me with an offer from the state to plead guilty to these charges, and then I would ultimately be sentenced 3 months later in 2015. So it's an interesting thing because my wife had no idea all of this was going on behind the scenes. I never told her that I had been charged with these crimes. I was hiding the paperwork. Things would come in the mail. I would hide that from her, so she never saw that. So she did not know about that at that time.
Wow. So what were you telling her was going on when you lost your job? What were you do? What did she think you were doing for work?
She thought I was still working for myself. I told her I was still working as a contractor, but even though I wasn't. So each day I would get up and put on my work boots and put on my clothes and go out as if I'm going off to work. Well, what I was doing was I was going out and I was just hustling money from whoever I knew, right? Or trying to hustle money. In fact, I rented some big, heavy construction equipment in 2014 from somebody I had known who still trusted me. One of the last people that still trusted me at that point. The equipment was worth over $100,000. I rented it from this guy, and I ended up selling it the next day for around $20,000. So things like that, so I would have money a little bit here and there to kind of show my wife, hey, here's some money for this or that. So there was always I was always able to come up with a little bit of money here and there and give it to my wife or pay something. So she kind of thought that everything was still working.
Wow.
But it just became a game of hustle, really.
Yeah. So 4th of February 2015, your wife finds out. How does she find out, and what's her reaction?
Right. And so we had just gotten back from a trip, and while we were out of town, her father found out. I had sent kind of a cryptic email to a family member just prior to us leaving on that trip about some gambling debts I had, and I just said, "Hey, I need to get this paid off." And that family member turned that over to my father-in-law while we were out of town. So we come back, and the very next day after we got back, I'll never forget it. My wife calls me that morning as I'm driving around hustling from people, and she says, "My dad just called me and he asked me to come over, and he sounded kind of weird. Do you know what's going on?" And I said, "No." I hung up the phone with my wife, and I kind of suspected something was happening. I didn't know what. And so I tried calling my wife several times that day, couldn't get a hold of her, which was really odd. I knew something. So I knew something was going on over the course of that day. I would finally get a call from my father-in-law later that afternoon, and he said, "We know what's going on." So they had done some research. He had done some research, figured out that I had a gambling problem. Had no idea of the scope or the magnitude at that time, but he knew there was a problem. And so it was that day that I got a call from him, and he said, "You're not welcome." Um, no, my wife said, "You're not welcome back at the house right now," and I wasn't welcome at my in-laws' house. So I had to get a hotel that night. And the very next day, they had arranged for an intervention for me to sit down with my family and a professional and address it.
So how did that go?
So that was strange. My father-in-law actually picked me up that morning, and I didn't really know what we were doing. Um, at that point, I knew that they knew, right? They told me they knew I had a gambling problem. He picked me up, and we went to some strange place, some strange building I had never been to. We walked down some dark hallways and into a room. And I walk into this room, and boom, all my family's sitting there. And then there's a stranger who I'd never met before. This lady sitting there. I'm like, whoa, what are we doing? And then it dawned on me what we were actually doing. It was an intervention, the ones you see on TV where the drug addict or the alcoholic or whatever is brought into a room by their family to try and fix or help them um, turn their life around. And that's what that was. And so I sat in that room and I listened to my family members talk about the pain and the anger that they had and how upset they were. But also too, how much they wanted me to go off and get help. And they had set it up to where I was, if I accepted, Minnesota, halfway across the country, and checked into a treatment center.
So they still didn't know at this point that you were going to you were going to go to prison, essentially.
So at this point, they have no idea of any of that. What would happen over the course of the next 30 days while I was in intense treatment halfway across the country, my wife and her family would uncover just about everything, right? They would find out all of the things I had done. They would find out about the criminal aspect of this, and they would also find out that I had this sentencing coming up literally 6 weeks after I had gone off to treatment. I had to go in for my sentencing, and it was that day I was going to be sent off to jail. They would find out all of this stuff while I was in treatment.
Wow. So when you're in treatment, do you have contact with any of them?
I was allowed to call my wife once every 3 days, and those were really difficult phone calls because all I wanted at that point was to know that I had a chance to save my marriage. Um, and my wife was great because she would give me that hope in those phone calls, but at the same time, I was only able to call once every 3 days, and over the course of those 3 days, I knew that she was uncovering more and more and more and more of what had happened over the last 9 years of our marriage. And so she would throw that at me in these phone calls and say, "Well, I guess what I just found out. I found out you just 2 years ago you took $28,000 from my retirement account without telling me." things like that she would discover while I'm in treatment, and then um, present to me over the phone, in these phone calls. And those were really difficult times, but yeah, that's how it went. Once every 3 days, I was able to call home.
Did the treatment help at all?
It did help. It really did, because what it did was, I walked into that place thinking, well, I'm just a bad person who can't stop gambling and can't stop lying and can't stop stealing. Nobody's doing this. No good person does this, right? So I walked into that place thinking that. But what I came to learn through the professionals and the staff there was, you're not necessarily a bad person. You're a sick person making bad choices. Okay. And so once I was able to realize that and understand the process in the brain um, that goes on with a gambling addict, I was able to settle down a little bit and regain a little bit of hope, and understand what this addiction actually is. And when I left there, they give you the tools, the mental tools to handle certain triggers and certain urges to gamble that you may come across as a gambling addict. And so, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be here without that. And that was basically the turning point for me in my life.
What's an example of a way someone can protect themselves from the urge to gamble once they've stopped gambling as an addict?
Right. It's a really difficult thing, so we, as gambling addicts, we develop these behaviors, these ingrained behaviors, because we've been living that way for so long. And it's just almost by default, we do these things. And really, it's surrounding yourself with people like you. That's one thing I did immediately after I left treatment was I started going to meetings and groups of people that were dealing with the same thing I was dealing with, because it's really hard for people on the outside that don't get it to relate to you. So I had to talk to people that could relate to me and I could relate to, because they're living the same nightmare. Okay. And so that was the first thing I had to do, was surround myself with people like me to stay grounded and talk through some of those triggers and some of those urges, and then it's a lifestyle change too. It's not um, putting yourself in the same environment. Like I had to change everything about the way I lived. I couldn't. Um, my whole thing was sports betting, but I couldn't go to games right away because that was a trigger for me. I that took a long time to be able to actually sit through a football game and just watch it for the sake of watching it instead of
Yeah.
gambling on it, right? And so it's a lot of things, but it starts with you know GA meetings, just like an alcoholic goes to AA meetings or whatever. It's being around the people that care about you and understand you.
Yeah. I think 100% that is. I think being around people who understand it is probably more important than being, because if you're around loved ones at that time, they can be helpful in some ways, but also really scrutinize you in a way that can probably send you back down that path if that's all you're around. Whereas if you're around people who understand the problems with it, the emotions of it, then I feel like that is going to be more helpful than just being around loved ones, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It's, again, people, and I include myself in this. I used to look at people. You can look at like a gambling addict and say, well, why don't you just stop? I didn't recognize it as an addiction, really, like you do with alcohol or drugs. A lot of people look at gambling and say, well, why don't you just stop? And so people on the periphery, family members and stuff like that that don't really get it, it's hard for them to get inside the mind of a gambling addict, and
Yeah.
relate. And so that's just it. You're right. I mean, it's just being around, surrounding yourself with people that are struggling with the same thing and actually get it.
Yeah. So you come out of treatment and you end up going to prison. So how long did you have between treatment and going to prison?
3 weeks. So I came home on March 7th of 2015, and on March 27th, so 20 days later, 3 weeks later, I went in for my sentencing, and not really knowing what was going to happen, what the judge was going to impose, right? I mean, I went in there thinking, well, I just got out of treatment, you know, maybe the judge will look favorably upon that, you know, and spare me the sentence and not send me away. But she was having none of it. So it was 4 months, you know, which could have been much longer, but I was fortunate to get 4 months and not more than that, but that's what it was.
So what was the first day in prison like?
Awful, terrible. It was, maybe the worst experience of my life. You're put in handcuffs. You know, you walk down a hallway. You're put in a dark room, and they take photos of you, and treated like um, you're treated like crap. And you know, you're thrown into a big tank with 19 other guys who really don't care about being in there because they're so used to being in there. And here I am. I had never been in that place before, and you're surrounded by people that don't care. There's fights every day. The first night, I remember there were probably 3 or 4 fights in this big tank I was in. You know, this big room with bunks in it. It's disgusting, right? And it's just, I remember staring at the walls and just thinking to myself, I was terrified, just thinking, what have I done? What in the world have I done? You know, and so that's what it was. That's what it was like that first day.
The time throughout jail, did it get any better, or was it just constantly, were you always like in fear of getting in a fight, something happening, all that?
Yeah, you know, after about 3 or 4 days, I made the decision to just stick to myself. I wasn't going to get involved with anybody's nonsense or engage in any conversations with anybody that I didn't. I mean, I stayed to myself, but I'll tell you, it wasn't all bad, right? I mean, there was a guy next to me. He was in the bunk next to me, and I remember talking to him every night. We would sit and talk and drink cold coffee at the end of the night. And he was a heroin addict, and we had really good conversations about. He had 2 kids. I had 1 kid. He had been living on the streets for 2 years with his wife, and they had lost their kids. And he wanted to get clean, and he wanted to get his kids back. And so through those conversations, we were able to develop this bond. And so um, that made me feel good about, you know, he left there a little bit before me, and he told me how much of a difference it made in his outlook on things just to talk to me. And so that gave me a little bit of hope, right? That I can actually help others at the same time as I was trying to help myself. So I can take some positive out of that time, you know, and I would eventually leave there in June of that same year, you know, and I remember walking out of there that day, and it was a feeling unlike anything I'd experienced in a long time. It was like this sense of freedom that I had, you know, and it was freedom from addiction, right? I finally felt free from that addiction. And so I think looking back on it now, as rough as that was, as dark as those days were in that place, I think I needed that time to kind of reevaluate and assess where I was in my life and you know, what I wanted to do with the rest of my life.
Yeah. Was there a point throughout your time in prison where you thought you would leave and your family would not be there to greet you outside?
Yes, there were many moments, and really, all I wanted, um, if I was able to have a wife and son to go back to, that's all I wanted. If I had that, that gave me the hope to go on with my life. But I had this fear. Yeah, I had this fear in the back of my mind that I was going to walk out of that and have nothing, have nobody left in my life, which would have been. I don't know that I could have come back if I had walked out of there and my wife, because a lot of people had left me. Right, many of my friends were gone forever. Many family members were gone forever. And if I walked out of there and didn't have a marriage to go back to, which I didn't at the beginning, but that took some time. But my wife told me there was a chance that we could put that back together, and that's what kept me going.
So when you were in prison, what were you doing on a daily basis? Were you allowed to work? Was there, trades you could learn? What were you doing?
So over here, you know, in the U.S., there aren't any programs set up in the system for gambling addicts, gambling addiction. There are no meetings that you can go to on a daily basis, or there's just nothing set up, So I was able to work in the morning and the afternoon, where I would go serve meals to other inmates on other floors, and that's always stuck with me. I would go up, for example, I would go serve breakfast on the 11th floor. I was on the 8th floor. I'd go up to the 11th floor, and I'm serving breakfast to rapists and murderers, and um, handing them meals through the little slot in the door. I remember, and something stuck with me. I remember looking at these guys thinking, what in the world have I done to get into this place?
Yeah.
But the reason I did that was because it just kind of kept my mind going a little bit. I was able to do something to break up the monotony of the day. But the rest of the day, I was just sitting in my tank with these guys on the 19 other guys on these bunks, and many of which are gambling on a daily basis. And I would just read books and stare at the walls.
I can't imagine the feeling, that feeling that you just described, like, what have I done to be in the same four walls as, a rapist and a murderer? Because I'd like, by the way you were describing it, you were in like a low security prison, with the bunks, there's like 20 people in a room. But to know that like a couple floors up, maybe there's these horrible, like scum of the earth humans, like I just can't imagine that gut wrenching feeling that it probably was, that you had to go and serve them food and deal with them.
It's hard to describe. I'm going to tell you a quick story. It was towards the end of my stay in there, and I was serving dinner to one of the inmates on the 11th floor, and this guy had killed 7 people. This guy had, and I'm just going to tell this story because this is what stuck with me. This guy and his girlfriend had killed 7 people, a family of 7. They shot little kids in the head, and I'll never forget it. He had his sentencing that day, and I watched it on TV in my tank with all the other guys in my bunk room. We watched his sentencing was replayed on the news, and he was either going to be sentenced to death or life in prison. And he was sentenced to life in prison. He didn't get the death penalty. So that very night, as I'm serving him dinner, I'll never forget how happy he was. I'm serving him dinner, and he had a smile on his face. He was grinning ear to ear, and he asked me if I can get him a couple magazines because he was just going to chill out and read some magazines that night. And I remember thinking to myself, again, I'm in a building with people like this. And it just stuck with me, and I'll never forget that interaction I had with that guy. And it's moments like that made me realize that this wasn't a place where I belonged. I had gone down a bad road,
Yeah.
made some bad choices, but this wasn't for me. And but those are kind of those are the people you come across in places like that.
Yeah, that's awful. So they're isolated, they're on their own. No one, because obviously if someone who's killed children, if he's in with a group of people, he's probably going to be dead.
Right, that's right. He's in a single cell, and they're not allowed out of their cell more than, I think it's 1 hour a day, not with, and they don't interact with any other inmates because, like you said, I mean, some of those people will, they know that they're going to be incarcerated for the rest of their life. So what do they care? They can take somebody out if they don't like them, and so, whereas, yeah, I was in a, like I said, a tank is what it's called, where you're in with 19 other guys in a big bunk room, basically.
After prison, when you get out and you go home to your wife, what were the first steps to rebuilding that relationship, that trust that you lost over the course of 9 years?
Right, and that's it. You just touched on it. It's trust. Oh, excuse me. And when you break that bond of trust, that's really difficult to get that back. All the money was one thing, but it's the trust. Once that's broken, it's a long road. And so, really, I just went back to work and immersed myself in my recovery and meetings, and my entire day was very regimented. I would go to work early in the morning. I'd work 10 to 12 hours a day. I'd come home. I'd go to a meeting. Um, I'd read books at night. I'd go to sleep, and I'd do that over and over again. And there was really no quick fix. I did told my wife that everything was going to be transparent. She knew exactly what I was doing, who I was talking to, who I was working with, everything. So that's where it started, was just transparency. But over time, it took really first couple of years to get to a point where she began to put her faith and trust in me again.
So your son's obviously he doesn't know about any of this that's going on, does he? That like you because he's so young, you've been to prison, doesn't know about the gambling addiction. So at what point was it that you told him and how did it feel when you did that?
Right. It's a great question. So, at that age, he was 5 when I went in there, far too young to understand or grasp any of that. Obviously he knew I was gone for a stretch of time there. And I think we told him I had to go away for work. I think is what we said to him at the time. But he still didn't quite understand it. Why he couldn't talk to me on the phone, why he couldn't FaceTime me, all these things. But we talked to him a couple years after that when he was, I think, 7 or 8 years old, and just kind of told him a little bit about it, but he was still pretty young to get it. It wasn't until earlier this year when he was 13 years old where we actually sat him down, laid it all out for him. We wanted to wait until he was old enough to kind of understand it. You know what I mean? And so really it wasn't until earlier this year where we told him everything.
Wow. So how did he feel when he was told that obviously his dad had been to prison and spent, is it $1 million on your gambling addiction?
Yeah. Yeah, it was. It was over $1 million, and he was upset about it. I mean, he scared him a little bit. He cried. It was a hard conversation to have. But it was necessary. And he's slowly but surely becoming more comfortable with it and asking questions. And we're very open about it. Like, if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Trying to bring the positive out of this, because there are so many positives now that have come from this. You know,
Yeah.
and trying to convey to him and help him understand what addiction does to people. It doesn't make them bad people, um, but there are consequences to choices that we make in life. And so there are a lot of learning elements and teaching elements to this, and that's kind of how we're approaching it.
So as you left prison, and you were looking for work, how hard was it to find a job and get back on your feet?
Yeah, and that was terrifying because in my mind, I'm walking out of that place thinking, how in the world am I ever going to get a good enough job to pay me the kind of money I need to make to pay off all this debt and get my life back in order? Am I ever going to be able to do that? So I immediately was able to get a job, but it was a job, you know, um, it was a landscaping job where I'm out there digging trenches and building walls. I mean, I can't, and I'm thinking, wow, I can't do this for the rest of my life. So,
Mm.
I was able to work right away, which was great. Um, but I also too realized that wasn't something that wasn't sustainable. You know, um, I would need to find something else, and slowly but surely, I've been able to um, get into different industries and different areas of work. In fact, we can touch on it a bit. I'm at a point where I'm traveling the country and speaking with college student athletes about the dangers of gambling and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So you did your TEDx talk, didn't you, in Spokane? Was it 4 or 5 months ago?
I did. That was back in October. So yeah, it was about 4 months ago.
So where did that come about? How did you get asked to be involved in that event?
So I'd come across somebody who told me they thought I should do one of those, and it's you don't just go and do one of those. He thought, you actually have to apply to that particular event. They call you in for an audition. They get hundreds of applications, right? And so they sort through it and pick out a handful that they would like to audition. And they brought me in and chose me to be one of the 10 speakers. But I think too, what kind of stood out about my talk and my idea was that this was kind of new, right? And that's the whole idea with the TEDx talk is bring something new to the table that society or we're not talking about, that most people don't know about. And so that's what I did. And, like I say, yeah, that was back in October, and it meant a lot to me because I'm trying to get the word out there that and raise awareness to what this actually is, because a lot of people just don't understand it.
Yeah. So there was that the sort of catalyst for doing more of these speaking events.
Right. It kind of happened simultaneously with some other people I had met over the last year. And I'm now working for a company that's based out of the UK called Epic Risk Management. And they are a group of people that all have sports backgrounds and all have a lived experience like myself, so we go and we speak with student athletes at different colleges and we talk to them about the dangers of gambling, like I said before, but we're talking in a way that resonates with them because we've lived it, right? It's not something where we're just lecturing them on what they should or should not do. It's this is what can happen. This is how it affects you. And I really connected with the guys and the people at this company. And so they brought me on and I'm working with them now on raising awareness and prevention and that sort of thing.
Have you made this into a full-time job?
I have now, yes. So yeah, so going back to the work, the question about finding work and all that, it's interesting that this has now become it's not only my passion, but it's also become my livelihood.
Yeah, and it's amazing that you've been able to do that, because I feel a lot of people who make mistakes usually end up in a rabbit hole if they can't find work, and then if it's work, it's like the job which you were saying you can't do forever, and they end up in this like rabbit hole of like going back into prison because there's no options for them, so they get into all sorts. But you've been able to create this avenue where you can now go and help other people from all over the world, which is amazing. So what's the best thing to you about being able to do this for a living now?
The best thing and the reason I'm so passionate about it is when you're able to make a difference with people, after speaking to a group or an audience, to have somebody come up and say, "Hey, my son is struggling. What can I do?" Or my wife or my husband has a problem. What can I do? And thanks for coming. And then when you're able to share with them some resources and some ideas, and they come back to you, whether it's 1 month or 1 year later, and say, "Hey, so and so is doing better, and thank you so much for being there that day, because otherwise we don't know if we would have been able to find a solution." That's what really drives me, and it's something that I've never been this passionate about anything work related in my life, and it all goes back to, for me, it all goes back to the guy from jail that I'd referred to earlier, the heroin addict. That's
Yeah.
kind of where it started, to be able to spend so many years of my life taking from people, and have such a low opinion of myself, to now be at a point where I'm able to make a difference and help people is it's really, it's fulfilling. And
Yeah.
that's what drives me.
So I wanted to spend some time towards the end on, because obviously now this is your job, it's to help people with gambling addictions. So people who are wanting to make the change and they've realized that they may or may not have realized that they've got a gambling addiction, how do you take the first steps towards recovery?
the first thing is you need to talk to somebody, whether that's, and this is something I never did. It was finally just put in my face. Had I talked to somebody earlier, it never would have gotten to the point where it got with me. So the main thing is to say something to somebody. Hey, I'm struggling with this. I think I'm losing control. And it doesn't have to be a family member. It doesn't have to be a close friend. Sometimes that's hard. And there's a lot of shame and a lot of guilt and a lot of embarrassment when it comes to this. It can be a complete stranger, which is sometimes easier. There are phone numbers to call. You can call, go to a GA meeting, a Gamblers Anonymous meeting, and talk to people that, like we talked about earlier, that can relate. I would say that's the first step, is to talk to somebody, go to a meeting, just tell somebody you're struggling, because what happens then is you open the door. Okay. And there are a lot of people out there that will help you. There are a lot of compassionate, caring people in this world that will help you. But that's the first step. And then from there, it's meetings, it's treatment. It's, for me, it's seeing a therapist on a regular basis that understands that gambling addiction. The more we talk about our problems and the more we open up to somebody, the better chance we have to turn it around.
Yeah. How can loved ones and friends support addicts through their time of addiction?
That's really, and that's the other aspect of this. Gambling addiction is hard on the addict for sure, but it's extremely hard on the family, from a financial standpoint for one. But secondly, they just don't know what to do. And a lot of times they're confused. They want to help, but they don't know how to help. And my son is, I just recently just spoke with a mom whose 21-year-old son has a gambling problem, and he keeps coming to her for money. And her first instinct is to give her son money, right? Okay, well, here, take this to pay off that credit card or this. That's not the right approach. The approach is, sure, help them out with essentials like food and gas or whatever, but make them accountable. You need to not enable that person, that family member, that friend. You need to hold them accountable and make them, once they get to a point where they realize, okay, well, I'm not going to just get handouts from everybody. They're going to have to come to a point where they admit there's a problem, and then they can address it. But it's a fine balance. It's a hard thing for the friend or the family member to know what to do, but it's really difficult to be tough on that person when they're struggling. But that's what needs to happen.
Yeah. On the thing of, helping out by buying food and what have you, for someone who's an addict, there is, in the UK, it's not necessarily for addicts, but it was made for students, but it works for, say, alcoholics, because so a supermarket in the UK, Asda, they created this voucher that parents could buy for their kids who'd gone to uni, which could only be spent on food. Could not be like, this voucher was not valid for alcohol. And I thought about it when I was told about it years ago. I was like, actually, that's really good for alcoholics, because you can give them money to go and buy food, but they'll always go and buy alcohol. If you buy them a voucher which is only for food, they literally have no other option but to buy food, which is a
Yeah,
way of getting around it. And I think you have to, it, there's the effort of, but you probably have to go out with them and buy it for them, so that you know that they're not using the money for gambling, for alcohol, for drugs, whatever. But in the end of the day, it's helping with those little incremental steps to get them to where they want to be.
that's just it. That's just it. It's that's a great thing. But like I said, it's a hard thing for the family member to know what to do. Their first instinct is to want to help, right? And that's why this is such a tough addiction for people to wrap their head around, because they just don't get it.
Yeah. So what are some addictive tendencies that people should look out for when they may think that someone has a addiction?
The first one is the obvious one. It's financial inconsistencies. Lies, um, isolation. With the gambling addict, we tend to isolate. We tend to become distant. You know, when you're having a conversation with somebody, a friend or a family member, and they're looking over your shoulder, or they seem lost, or they're not focused on you or what you're talking about. Those are all signs. You know, like we talked about earlier, you can recognize usually when somebody has a drug problem or an alcohol issue. You know, but if there are financial inconsistencies, lies, the deception and the lies, that's a huge part of this. Okay, those are things to look out for. And then also to the, like I said, the isolation and the distance. If there's you know, there tends to be a disconnect between the gambling addict and their friends and family members. So those are some of the main things to look out for.
Mm-hmm. So what resources are there out there for addicts to use?
Right. So the first one is, you know, and I want to throw this in there too, because this is real important. The suicide rate for gambling addiction is 12 times higher than that of any other addiction. Okay. And so there's the national, well, in the US, there's a national suicide prevention line that you can call. There's also 1-800-GAMBLER, I think it is. And there are also local GA meetings, local Gamblers Anonymous meetings in most areas. Those are the things that, like we talked about earlier, those are ways to reach out for help. When it comes to treatment, unfortunately, there aren't nearly enough treatment facilities in the US anyway that deal with specifically with gambling addiction. There are a handful of inpatient facilities in the country. Fortunately, I was able to go to one of them. You know, those are some of the main resources that the gambler can look out for. But it's really just goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Once you're able to talk to somebody, they can kind of point you in that direction and help you.
So one final question for you, just to finish up. How would you like to be remembered?
That's a good one. A tough question. I think, as you know, first and foremost, as a good father and a good husband. You know, you know, I wasn't during my addiction, right? And so that family to me is number one. So a good father and a good husband. Aside from that, somebody that went out of their way to help people. You know, it's really important for me to help addicts. Not necessarily, doesn't necessarily need to be a gambling addict. I know that better than most. But addiction is addiction, and I would like to be remembered as somebody that went out of their way to help people that were struggling in their addiction.
So I can't thank you enough for your time on this, and I think it's a really insightful podcast, especially for people who are struggling with not just gambling addiction but different addictions. So where can people find your stuff, or if they want to reach out to you about like an addiction, how can they contact you?
So a couple ways, my Twitter is a great way to find me and find out what I'm doing and things like that. It's at Patrick Chester 9, the number 9. Also to my website, which should be up and running now. We had to do some work to it. It's patrickchester.com. And I throw this out there too from time to time, and I'm not afraid to do it. People can call me, and my phone number is 425-492-0556. And I take calls from anybody, anytime, anywhere, if they're struggling with any form of addiction.
Amazing. I really appreciate that. And hopefully through this episode, we can help a few people with possible addictions that they have, or at least raise awareness of what could be going on in someone's life. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate you coming on.
Ethan, thank you, man. I really appreciate you having me on. And like you said, hopefully this helps some people and just sheds some light on an issue that a lot of people just don't know about.
I hope you enjoyed that episode with Patrick Chester. Remember, his links will be in the description below, and also check out the podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and all podcast platforms, including YouTube. Thank you for listening.